Hello, my name is Helen Davis, and my chapter in David's edited collection was entitled The Metanarrative of Down Syndrome, Proximity to Animality. My chapter traced how the Victorian medical discourse around idiocy, and I'll be putting that in scare quotes throughout, repeatedly made comparisons between people with cognitive disability and animals. I then considered how such a metanarrative has been both invoked and challenged in contemporary literature. So my interest in this topic is deeply personal. My late sister, Elizabeth, had Down syndrome, and there's a very old picture of us together there on the slide. Of course, this gives me no special claim to speak on behalf of people with Down syndrome, and I do not intend to do so. However, I will be returning to Elizabeth shortly. So, my next slide. The origins of the medical classification of Down syndrome come in the 19th century with the work of John Langdon Down, and there is a portrait of him on the slide. So, when he was working at Earlswood Asylum, he observed some physical characteristics that a group of some patients in his care had in common with people of Far East Asian heritage. And he coined the category of Mongolian idiocy, a highly racist and ableist classification that would persist well into the 20th century. It wasn't until the 1960s that the term Down's syndrome, with a possessive apostrophe that I am not using in this presentation, entered medical vocabulary. So Downs' idea was that these traits were regressive, atavistic throwbacks to a more primitive stage of human development. And, you know, note the title of his first publication on the topic, Observations on an Ethnic Classification of Idiots, which was published in 1866. He's clearly invoking the racist ideology that other ethnic groups were inferior to white Westerners, which was reflecting the dominant colonial ideology of the period. So in that first article, Langdon Down does mention degeneration. So degeneration theory has its origins in the 18th century with the construction of different racial types, but comes to fuller fruition in the Victorian era with the work of Charles Darwin. So Darwin said very little about human evolution in Origin of Species, but he would discuss human evolution and potential degeneration in The Descent of Man, which was published in 1871. So, for example, in this book, Darwin remarks upon traits such as imitation being, and I quote here, found in monkeys, microcephalous idiots, and in the barbarous races of mankind. Okay. It should be noted that Langdon Down made similar remarks. So his later work discusses different types of idiocy, and he concludes that so far as instinct is concerned, the young animal is on a higher platform than the idiot baby. Okay. What we see here is a Victorian willingness to compare the intelligence of animals and people with cognitive disability, suggesting a spectrum where some humans are closer to the state of non-human animals than others. So as the century progressed, anxiety about the supposed deterioration of the human race gained increased medical authority. And so Western scientists were studying their own populations for traces of what they termed regression. So those deemed criminal, people of colour, queer people, the poor, and of course, people with both physical and cognitive disability were considered to be subjects of degeneration who needed to be managed in some way. And of course, from this develops the eugenics movement. Eugenics casts a very long shadow into the 20th century, as I'm sure you're aware. And we should note here that eugenic principles were applied to disabled human populations. So I'm talking about things like enforced sterilisation, institutionalisation and containment, all of which originated in animal breeding practices. So, to return to my own personal interest in the topic, when I was at school in the 1990s, I was tasked with copying out some notes on chromosomes in a school science lesson. So when I turned to the page, there was an illustration of a child with Down syndrome, and on the next page was a picture of an orangutan. I hesitated, pondering what was being implied by this proximity. So the teacher came to see why I wasn't working, and I didn't really know how to say this, so I kind of spluttered, this, did you know my sister has Down syndrome? And her behaviour changed. She sat down next to me, cooing with sympathy about what a shame this was for my family. She then said it must be a great comfort that people with Down syndrome are so happy and affectionate. Now, this was truly astonishing to me, not least because Elizabeth was just as cynical and reserved as myself and the rest of my immediate family. But in my chapter, I used this example of the location of social power in relation to who constructs and controls the metanarrative of Down syndrome. The medical discourse of the textbook intersects with the approved social authority of the science teacher over a teenage student, and more importantly, that student's sister, who she had never met. So, as an example of how this proximity to animality plays out in literary representation, I discussed Doris Lessing's novel, The Fifth Child, which was published in 1988. And the picture on the slide is the book cover of the first edition. So this novel tells the story of a couple who have a number of children in close succession, much to the annoyance of their family, who think they are being very selfish. Nevertheless, David and Harriet, their first 4 children, are healthy and happy, and all is well in the world. On the other hand, Harriet's sister, Sarah, gives birth to a child with Down syndrome who is named Amy. However, when Harriet is expecting her 5th child, she has an extremely difficult pregnancy, and the unborn baby is figured as, and I'm quoting here, a savage thing, the creature, the monster. So when the 5th child, Ben, is born, Harriet labels him Neanderthal baby due to his size, strength, and unusual appearance. So throughout the narrative, it's Ben that is cast as the atavistic throwback, okay? But Amy is also figured as being proximate to animals as well. So as Ben grows older, he becomes more violent, and pets start going missing. A visitor's dog is killed, so is a neighbour's cat. And Harriet suspects Ben. So the family become quite tentative about visiting, and the sister Sarah asks whether it's all right to bring Amy. The implication being that Amy is more vulnerable to Ben's violence than the so-called normal children of the family. And this position of Amy being closer to the state of the family pets is reiterated when they do visit. And I quote here from the novel: Amy, who expected everyone to love her, would go to Ben. This afflicted infant was radiant with affection, suddenly became silent. Her face was woeful, and she backed away, staring at him, just like Mr. McGregor, the poor cat. So the characterisation of Amy thus references that other meta-narrative of the happy and affectionate nature of people with Down syndrome that I mentioned earlier. She's also being figured here as having some sort of animal instincts in relation to Ben's deviance. Seemingly, both animals and children with Down syndrome are both to be pitied in some way, evidenced by the vocabulary of tragedy, afflicted, poor, that is being applied to their respective positions in relation to Ben. Okay, so let me tell you another story. Some of the finest times of my childhood were spent listening to my sister Elizabeth's stories. We would sit in our bedroom and she would spin elaborate, hilarious yarns featuring a girl named Georgina, her companion, her excellent companion named Superdog, and the pranks they played on their arch nemesis, who was called Mr. Gorbachev. Now, in our defence, it was the late 80s and he was on television a lot at the time, okay? But Elizabeth's imagining of Superdog, I think, had much in common with the theorist Donna Haraway talks about in her book When Species Meet. Okay, so Elizabeth's fictional creation was most definitely a dog, but Superdog worked and played alongside Georgina in his own canine way. They had their obvious differences, but their lives, interests and emotions were entwined. Their relationship was not hierarchical. Georgina might ask Superdog to do stuff, but Superdog was just as likely to modify and challenge Georgina's decision-making. They shared a mutual respect, appreciation, and understanding. Elizabeth never specified if Georgina had Down syndrome, but I suspect this might have been the case. I also suspect that the philosopher Peter Singer would have preferred Superdog to Elizabeth. His argument in Animal Liberation, first published in 1975, kind of introduced this idea that the oppression of animals should be considered in the same vein as racism and sexism. However, his use of cognitive disability as a test case for exploring the respective ethics of killing humans and non-human animals is deeply problematic. So he doesn't actually mention Down syndrome in Animal Liberation, but in the mid-80s, he devoted a co-authored book exploring issues around the euthanasia of children with Down syndrome and other disabilities, concluding that such killing might well be in the best interests of families and society more broadly. And as I'm sure you're aware, he's returned to this idea many times in his career since. So Sonara Taylor, her work, Beasts of Burden, and I've put a picture of that, the book cover on the slide. She considers sites of shared oppression between people with disabilities and animals, including, and I quote, ableist paradigms of language and cognitive capacity, which she says have led to the use and abuse of both groups in a myriad of ways. So she also offers the radical possibility of identification between people with disabilities and animals, this idea of claiming animal. So, understandably, and she talks about that from the perspective of her own physical disability. So understandably, her commentary about the ways in which people with cognitive disabilities might claim animality is rather more tentative, because she acknowledges that speciesism doesn't necessarily keep people from wanting to identify as animal, dehumanization does. So, is there merit in people with Down syndrome claiming animality? I am not the person to answer that, but let me give you an example to think about. So in 2018, the Canadian Down Syndrome Association launched the Endangered Syndrome campaign, featuring a short video of actors with Down syndrome costumed as various endangered species, including a polar bear, a lion, you know, etc. basically. And there's a slide, the picture on the slide is a still from that video. So sharing the line, the actors you know, say together, like some animals, people with Down syndrome are endangered. That's why we're applying to be the first people on the endangered list. And the association issued a statement with this, articulating that the global Down syndrome community is shrinking. And although they're not explicit about that, I think that's to do with you know, increased use of prenatal testing and subsequent termination. And the association is also highlighting the barriers that people with Down syndrome experience in relation to access to education, housing, employment, quality of life. So my point is the aims of the campaign are certainly laudable, but this comparison between people with Down syndrome and animals proved very problematic for some commentators, and there was a social media backlash. Okay. So Francie Munzo, a woman with Down syndrome who was interviewed by a news channel at the time, she said, and I quote, "It doesn't matter who you are. I don't like people comparing me to an animal. It's not fair." But on the other hand, Dylan Harmon, who was one of the actors starring in the video, said, "The campaign is about our existence in life. Everyone has a purpose." So in my chapter, I also considered the excellent novel by Sarah Knake, Sing Fox to Me, which was published in 2016. And the second picture on the slide is the front cover of that book. So Knake offers some really interesting alternative visions of human-animal connections in relation to Down syndrome and other disabilities. So I won't go into that now, but I want to leave you with the following thought. Is fiction a safer place to imagine the progressive potential of claiming animal for both people with cognitive disability and non-human animals, rather than in the material conditions and oppression of lived experience of the normative social order? As I said before, I'm not answering that question, okay? And Elizabeth Davis is unfortunately not around to be part of the ongoing conversation. Nevertheless, her tales of Georgina and Superdog and their interspecies connection have now reached an audience beyond our childhood bedroom. That narrative does not dismantle the automatic authority of that school textbook, but it does offer an alternative story. Thank you very much.